about your latest book, Cosmic Chemistry: Do God and Science Mix? Now, this is actually a book that had its first life in the book God's Undertaker, which I think was probably published nearly 15 years or so ago. Why did you write that book first time round, and what's made you want to revisit it this time round?
Well, for many years I've been interested in the whole question of the relationship between science and the God question. After all, I was a mathematician, and even in school days, I was curious. Where does mathematics fit into science? And where does science fit into the whole picture of our understanding of the universe? Does it tell us everything, or do we need more? And I had been interacting with the whole science-religion debate since my middle teens. I came across a book by a chemist who taught in the Cambridge Tech called R.E.D. Clark, and he really sparked my mind to start thinking about these things. I was simply fascinated to read a scientist who believed in God and who felt beyond that science was giving evidence of the existence of God. So it started very early. And then, because I was in the university world, I began increasingly to be asked to give talks relating my faith in God to my work in mathematics and so on. And people began to say, you ought to put this in a book. So the pressure grew, and of course the topic grew. So in the end, I gave in, and I decided to write this book called God's Undertaker: A Science Buried God, which was my first attempt, actually, at a book in this genre.
And I really enjoyed reading it the first time round. Obviously, 15 plus years later on, a lot of water under the bridge. But essentially, do you feel that those issues you were speaking into are still live today, especially the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, and others, who were saying God and science don't mix very explicitly?
Yeah, that's right. They were saying it then, and they're still saying it, although perhaps not quite so convincingly now. And what I find is there is enormous interest. I suppose it's unreasonable to judge it just by audience size, but since the lockdown, for example, doing Zoom conferences all over the world, the attendance at them and the questioning is all there. And perhaps it's even more intense than it was before, because people have, with the passage of time, less background in these things.
What were some of the key challenges that you were meeting when you wrote the book first time round, and that you addressed today? Specifically, of course, The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins had a huge reception, a best-selling book all over the world, and very much putting the case that God has been defeated, essentially, by scientific progress. What were you meeting, I suppose, in Oxford, obviously, as a contemporary of Richard Dawkins teaching here? Were you finding that kind of view was being expressed in the student body by other academics? Were you meeting it generally when you went around?
Oh, I often heard people say, I'm a Dawkins man, even if they hadn't read his stuff. And what I found myself doing was taking it seriously. I felt it's very important not to just have a knee-jerk reaction. I don't believe that stuff. But to read what they had to say, take it seriously, analyze it, and see if there was an adequate response to it. And what I discovered, in a way to my amazement, is that some of the intellectual foundations, indeed many of them, of Dawkins-type arguments were very shaky. I mean, you mentioned the book, The God Delusion, and delusion is a psychiatric term. And to my amazement, I discovered that Dawkins, using this concept, had never consulted any leading psychiatrists who disagreed with him profoundly on the idea of God being a delusion. And that old Freudian argument, which he used and felt it really dismissed God, he couldn't see that actually it's a double-edged sword. There's a wonderful psychiatrist in Germany, Alfred Lutz, who wrote a book called A Brief History of the Great One, eine kleine Geschichte des Größten. And he said, you know, if there is no God, then Freud's argument is brilliant. God is a delusion if there is no God. But of course, if there is a God, then atheism is a delusion.
Yeah.
And the point is, the bottom line, which I felt was really important, and I've written about it, is that Freud can't help you when it comes to the question, is there a God or not? And Dawkins had totally bypassed that. And what I found on close investigation was that even atheist writers were getting a little bit upset and even ashamed of the kind of thing that Dawkins wrote, people like Michael Ruse and so on. So I felt it was necessary to clear up what were misunderstandings even of the nature of science, which I was surprised to find in a writer who is a scientist, but also misunderstandings about the nature of God.
Yes.
They were denying the existence of God in whom nobody believed.